In late 2013, on a screen in a basement laboratory at Harvard Medical School, a graph appeared that should not have appeared. The geneticist running the analysis stared at it for a long time. He rotated the axis. He reran the algorithm. He pulled the raw data and resequenced a sample for the third time. The graph kept showing the same thing. There was a signal in the DNA of certain native South American populations that connected them, statistically and unmistakably, to populations on the other side of the world, to people in Australia, to people in New Guinea, to the Onge of the Andaman Islands. And the signal was not faint enough to ignore. The geneticist's name was Pontus Skoglund. The lab was David Reich's. The paper that would eventually come out of that night, and the years of additional work that followed, would name a population that no one had ever met. A population whose bones had never been found. A population that, by every reasonable accounting, no longer existed. They called it Population Y. The Y stood for Waipiquera, a word in the Tupi language that means, roughly, ancestor, a ghost, threaded through the cells of the living. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what geneticists mean by a ghost population. The phrase is technical, and it sounds dramatic, but it is actually a careful claim. A ghost population is a group of human beings that contributed genetic material to one or more present-day populations, but is itself extinct or has not been directly sampled. We can see them only by their signature in their descendants. We can describe their broad characteristics, their relationship to other ancestral groups, their approximate contribution percentage, the timing of their contact with other populations, by inference. We cannot see their faces, we cannot read their texts, we cannot dig up a single skeleton and say, here, this was one of them. They are mathematical objects with biological consequences. There are now several known ghost populations in the human genetic record. The Basal Eurasians, a group that branched off from the rest of non-African humanity very early and contributed to ancient Near Eastern populations. The ancient North Eurasians, a group represented by the Malta boy, in Siberia, who contributed to both European farmers and Native Americans. The Denisovans, who were physical creatures we have a few teeth and a finger bone of, but whose population structure is largely ghost-mapped. And, in the Americas, Population Y. Population Y's defining feature is that it carries ancestry from a lineage that, in the modern world, is most strongly represented by Australasians, indigenous peoples of Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. Not because Australasians migrated to the Americas, they did not, but because, somewhere deep in the human family tree, the source population for Australasians and the source population for one early American group shared a common ancestor that was separate from the East Asians and Siberians who contributed to most Native Americans. That common deep lineage left a fingerprint. The fingerprint is what Skoglund saw on his screen. The 2015 Nature paper that announced Population Y had been preceded by an earlier signal, also unexpected. In 2014, a team led by Manasa Raghavan, then at the University of Copenhagen, had sequenced the genome of the Malta boy, a Paleolithic child whose remains were recovered near Lake Baikal in Auwo, southern Siberia, dated to about 24,000 years ago. The Malta boy turned out to be a ghost too, of a different kind. He represented a population, the ancient North Eurasians, or ANE, that had contributed substantially to both ancestral Native Americans and ancestral Europeans. Roughly 14 to 38% of Native American ancestry, depending on the population, traces back to this ANE source. The Malta paper effectively rewrote the genetic origin story of Native Americans. They were not just East Asian. They were a mix of East Asian and ancient North Eurasian, blended somewhere in Beringia or its margins. So even before Population Y, the textbook story of Native Americans descended from East Asians had been complicated. The ANE ghost made it a hybrid story. The Population Y ghost, a year later, made it a triple hybrid story for at least some southern populations. And nobody knew where the Population Y source had come from. That is where we still are, in 2026. Skoglund's team, now at the Francis Crick Institute in London, has continued to refine the signal. Additional studies, including a 2021 paper by Marcos Araujo Castro e Silva, then at the University of Sao Paulo, and a 2022 study by Tabita Hunemeyer, have replicated and extended the finding. The population Y signal is robust. It is most concentrated in certain Amazonian populations, particularly the Surui and Caritiana. It is weaker, but still detectable in some other South American and a few Mesoamerican groups. It is essentially absent in North American indigenous populations. The current best estimate is that population Y contributed somewhere between 2 and 3% of the ancestry of the Surui and Caritiana, with the contribution likely happening somewhere in the late Pleistocene, perhaps between 15 and 20,000 years ago. The geographic distribution of the signal in modern South America suggests that the contribution was localized. It did not get into the founding population of all Native Americans, only into a specific subset that later moved into and through Amazonia. So where did population Y itself come from? 3 main hypotheses are still on the table. The first is the additional wave hypothesis. Population Y was a separate migrating group that came into the Americas at roughly the same time as the main founding population, contributed in a limited way to certain southern lineages, and otherwise vanished. Under this model, the Americas were settled not by one wave, but by at least 2 distinct streams of migrants, both from Northeast Asia, or Beringia, but carrying different deep ancestry. The second is the structured source hypothesis. The Beringian standstill population, the source of all Native Americans, was not homogeneous. It contained within it some component of Australasian-related ancestry that was unevenly distributed among the people who eventually moved south. Most of them carried very little of it. A small subgroup that ended up as the founders of the Amazonian populations carried more. Under this model, no separate wave is needed. There was one wave, but it was internally diverse. The third is the ghost Asian source hypothesis. There was, in the late Pleistocene, a population somewhere in Southeastern Asia or Eastern Eurasia that carried mixed ancestry from both the East Asian and Australasian deep lineages. That population contributed to the Beringian standstill people in a small way, and the descendants who eventually reached South America preserved the contribution at higher levels than the descendants who stayed north. The ghost source is not Australasian in any modern sense. It is an extinct intermediate population that we have not yet identified that happened to share deep ancestry with the people who became today's Australasians. Each of these hypotheses makes slightly different predictions. The additional wave model predicts that we should eventually find ancient genomes in the Americas that are mostly population Y, perhaps 30 or 50 or 80%, rather than the 2 or 3% we see in the modern Surui. The structured source model predicts that we should see traces of population Y ancestry distributed across many ancient Beringian samples, just at varying frequencies. The ghost Asian source model predicts that we should eventually find an ancient genome in late Pleistocene Asia that carries the right mixture to be the donor. So far, no ancient genome from the Americas with high population Y content has been recovered. The oldest American skeletons we have sequenced, Anzac I, Kennewick Man, the Upward Sun River infants, all show the standard Beringian-derived signature with no significant population Y contribution. Either the population Y source population entered through a different route and is buried in places we have not yet excavated, or the structured source model is correct, and population Y was always a minor component, never a major one. The Lagoa Santa skeletons in Brazil, once famously argued to be the remains of an Australasian-like population that predated the East, Asian-derived Native Americans, based on the cranial morphology of Lucia, the so-called first Brazilian, were a hopeful lead. But when teams led by Andre Strauss and others sequenced their DNA in 2018 and the years after, the genomes turned out to be standard Native American, with only the same small population Y contribution found in the modern Amazonian groups. Their cranial features had been misleading. The cells were unambiguous, so we are left with a ghost, or really, 2 ghosts. The ancient North Eurasian ghost, whose face we have seen in the Malta Boy, and the population Y ghost, whose face we have not seen at all. Here is the deeper meaning of this. The peoples of the Americas, as the genetic record now shows them, are not a single, neat, late-arriving population. They are the descendants of multiple deep lineages braided together over tens of thousands of years. East Asian, ancient North Eurasian, possibly Australasian related, at low frequency in certain southern groups. That braiding happened in places, Siberia, Beringia, the Pacific shoreline, that left almost no archaeological record we can yet read. The people we now call Native American are the consolidated, layered, deep result of a process that started long before any of them set foot in what we now call the Americas. And the ghosts are still in the room. Every time the Saruian Caritiana DNA gets analyzed, the signal shows up again. Every time a new ancient genome comes online, researchers ask whether it is going to be the one that finally puts a face to population Y. So far, none of them has. The ghost remains a ghost. The names matter. In some Tupi-speaking traditions, Yipiquera is not just a word for ancestor in the abstract. It is a word for the deep ones, the originals, the ones who were there before memory, and whose presence in the forest can still be felt in the silence between bird calls. Skoglund chose well. The genetic signal he found may eventually be tied to a specific population whose archaeological remains we will recover and sequence. Or it may stay a ghost forever, traceable in the cells of the living, but never quite resolved into a face. Either way, the word fits. What does it say about us, more broadly? That there are ghosts in our DNA? It says that the past is wider than the populations that survived into the present. It says that the human story is one of branches that ended and branches that continued, of people who walked impossibly long distances and left almost no record of having done so, of contributions that look small in the percentages but feel large when you sit with them. A 2% contribution from a vanished people means that 2 out of every 100 segments of DNA in a Surui person's cells trace back to someone whose name we will never know, whose language we cannot reconstruct, whose grave we will probably never find. And that person is still there. Faintly. Always faintly. In the Strand. In the Reich lab, the work goes on. New samples come in. The graph that startled Pontus Skoglund a decade ago is now part of every textbook account of American prehistory. The ghost is well documented. The ghost is named. The ghost is, in some ways, the most famous unidentified human population in the world. And somewhere, in soil that has not yet been excavated, or under water that has not yet been drained, or in a layer of permafrost that has not yet been sampled, the source population may still be waiting to be heard. Until then, they live in their descendants. They live in the forest, peoples whose cells carry the signal. They live in the careful prose of papers that name them without claiming to know them. They live as a reminder that human history is full of people whose stories we will reconstruct only partially, only through traces, only with the help of those they left behind. The strangest thing about a ghost in the cells is that it is, in every meaningful biological sense, alive. The DNA is being expressed every minute of every day in the bodies of the living people who carry it. The proteins it codes for are being made. The cells it influences are dividing. The vanished population is, in a sense, still doing its work, quietly, partially, through the agency of the people who inherited its small contribution. The ghost is not nothing. It is not a fossil. It is an ongoing presence, distributed across millions of cells in dozens of villages along the rivers of the western Amazon. This is the part of archaeogenetics that the field's critics sometimes miss. The work is not about declaring vanished peoples extinct. It is about recognizing that they continue, in real biological terms, in the populations they helped to make. The population Y people, whoever they were, are not gone. They are smaller. They are diffused. They are mixed in with much larger contributions from other sources, but they are present in every Caritiana child who is born. They are present in every Surui elder who tells a story. They are present whenever the cells of those communities divide and rebuild themselves. A ghost, threaded through the cells of the living, still here, and, perhaps most surprising of all, still working.